The Atlantic Monthly, for those of you who are not from America, the Atlantic Monthly, I wouldn't say it's a progressive magazine, but it's certainly not a reactionary magazine. It's certainly on the left of center within the U.S. publications. So this is a very mainstream article. But unlike the reaction to Dan's work that he was talking about earlier with you this morning, a firestorm ensued beginning a couple days after Herrnstein published this article and what ultimately came to be called Herrnstein's syllogism. Herrnstein he passed away, a Harvard psychologist. And with days of the publication of the Atlantic article, there were protests of his class. He had to be accompanied by armed security guards. He had to cancel talks, not about his syllogism, but talks. He was actually a learning psychologist. He had to cancel talks where he wanted to talk about his pigeon research. He was called a racist, although if you read the Atlantic piece is titled IQ. He didn't talk anything about race. There's nothing about race at all in the whole piece. It was all about social class. When I talked to my mentor, Tom Bouchard, my long-term friend, about the status of the field, he's more pessimistic than I am. I think we've come a phenomenal way where today we can talk about genetic influences on social class. Whereas when I started, and I don't take any credit for this, when I started, it would lead to demonstrations. I recognize that there's still demonstrations, there's still people who can't speak. But we've come a long way. This is a piece that was published, a nice short commentary published by Erica Hayden in Nature a few years back. I think I'll give you the citation there, where she talks about what she calls taboo genetics. Really, taboo genetics is behavioral genetics. But the point of the article is that behavioral genetics is actually beginning to enter the mainstream. And it's beginning to enter the mainstream because of things like James is doing with the SSGAC, or because we're able to recruit young, bright individuals like Dan Belsky into the field. If you go to the actual HTML version of this, there's a link to I'm sure, unrepresentative surveys where she asks the reader to say whether or not people should engage in genetic research on intelligence. And there's other questions there as well. And you can see that, I'm sure it's not representative, but overwhelmingly, what people would have rejected 40 years ago, scientists are endorsing today. And I think that's good. I think, again, you've seen it with the talks we've already heard about today. And hopefully I'll be able to give further illustrations of this. I think to understand social outcomes, we need to use behavioral genetic methodologies. I don't have a grand model here, but I have a theme. And my theme is basically this, is that, as I'm sure we all recognize here, there's a growing attention and indeed anxiety surrounding social inequality and social mobility. And later in the talk, actually much later, I'll say something about those are not the same phenomena. We want to understand the origin of those phenomena. I think behavioral genetics has an awful lot to contribute here. I think, again, in Dan's beautiful talk this morning, you saw some of that, and hopefully I'll be able to provide some illustrations here in my talk as well. A couple of caveats before I begin. I'm going to talk a lot about social mobility, but when I do so, I'm going to focus on educational mobility. Part of that is just logistics, it's feasibility. The ages my longitudinal samples are at, the oldest age I've got assessment data is age 29. At age 29, we know how far you've pretty much gone in school, but we don't know other things like your ultimate income and your occupation. There's another aspect about focusing on education, though. As a psychologist, if I think of social outcomes, I actually think education is probably the most important, and it's the one that's probably the most sensitive to policy changes. It's hard to change income. It's much easier to change it to educational attainment, although not necessarily easy. Second caveat, I'm going to be parochial. I apologize. I'm going to talk about the U.S. experience because, again, by feasibility, I've collected the data in the U.S. I don't expect that what we observe in the U.S. is universal. And in fact, some studies, some behavioral genetic studies, and some of these I'll refer to, do suggest that when you're talking about social outcomes, the structures actually do vary by country in ways I don't think we really understand yet. Third, some of the data I'll give you has been published, but not all of it. Some of it is in progress, so just recognize that. And then finally, this was alluded, I think Dave was making the point yesterday about the importance, as well as others, the importance of replication. Some of the data I'm going to report, especially the data on educational mobility, is based on one sample. It's a large sample. I kind of like the sample. It's my sample. But it's a single study. I'd love to find people I could replicate some of the things I'm going to talk about. Okay, so I'm going to begin by talking about the Minnesota twin family study. And we use this to try to understand the individual level contributions to social success, educational success. Emily talked a little bit earlier about the Minnesota Center for Twin and Family Research. We've been doing longitudinal research for about 30 years. And we have a basic sampling unit. And actually, the sampling unit is important. It's a family. And a family consisting of a pair of offspring who we initially assess when they're in usually early adolescence, and their parents. And having the parents is actually, I think, something that makes our sample rather unique. The families are distinguished with the type of offspring that we've collected. It's always only two offspring. Families obviously have more than two or sometimes less than two, but in our case, it's hard to deal logistically with having variable number of siblings, so we only allow two per family. There could be monozygotic twins, dizygotic twins, biological siblings, adopted siblings. I'm going to talk first about the twins. So we have four-member families, and in fact, across all our research, we have about 2,500 families, about 10,000 individuals we've been tracking for up to 30 years in some cases. And we do get the parents. Those dads can be tough, but we get about 90% of the dads, we assess them. And when we assess them, it's actually usually for about 8 hours. They come to our labs for about 8 hours. I don't know if Dan's here, but this is our participation. This is just the twins. So we began there's two cohorts. One we began at 11, the other began at 17. That doesn't matter too much. But these are the numbers. These are individuals. They're not even because there's a couple several triplets in there. Bad if you do twin research to get triplets. They mess up every form. But we didn't know that when we started. We don't do quite as well as Dunedin, but we're kind of in the ballpark. We get about 90% very consistently. Again, I'm going to look at data from age 29. We continue to assess them. They're at midlife now, but that data, those assessments aren't complete, so I'm not going to use that data. We have to get that photographer from Dunedin, much better than our photographer. But I just feel blessed. I don't know the twins personally, but to see lives unfold. This is a pair of young women who we first saw, the target age is 11, but they don't all come in on their 11th birthday. At age 12, this is with their parents. The same ones at, I guess, 15, 19, 22, 25, and 29. And to see them, their lives unfold in parallel, it's absolutely fascinating. In the talk here, I'm going to focus, though, on data we collected when they're 17, and I can do that with both cohorts, and then their outcomes, their social outcomes at age 29. And again, the assessments are fairly comprehensive. Most of our funding came from drug abuse and alcohol abuse institutes from the NIH. So we mostly study mental health and substance abuse. But again, we've assessed academic-related things. So here are their IQs. We do give an IQ test. I'll call it general cognitivity later. The rates at which, by age 29, they have a college degree. This illustrates a couple things. One, of course, is the offspring have college degrees at a higher rate than their parents. That's the secular increase that you know about. But the rates are pretty high. These are all from Minnesota, and I don't know how many of you know Garrison Keillor, but if you know Garrison Keillor, you know that if you're living in Minnesota, we're all above average, right? So we should be smarter, and we should all get our college degree. The other thing, which I'm not going to talk about, but I find absolutely fascinating, is, and I think Camilla talked about this yesterday, is the women. Really, the secular increase has been phenomenal for the women in terms of educational attainment. It's there for the men, but nowhere near as much. And men are, in our sample, you can see they're lagging quite a bit. And it's an interesting phenomenon. I have some speculation about it, but I'm going to talk about that today. Another thing our data illustrates is a well-known phenomenon is that educational attainment aggregates in families. This is just the likelihood that a child, one of the twin offspring, got a college degree as a function of the number of parents with a college degree. And you see for both men and women that there's a rather strong, or at least a moderate association. And in fact, even though women are graduating at a higher rate, the odds ratio associated with having one more parent having a college degree is not significantly different. It's fairly similar, the two. So, not surprising, education aggregates in families. But why does it? What I'm interested in, why it aggregates in families. Of course, we know that the first thing that a behavioral geneticist like myself will say, well, it can aggregate in families because of genetic factors or environmental factors. And I'm going to show you that indeed, not surprisingly, both are important. But I'd like to look at that a little bit more deeply, maybe kind of relevant to the questions you've been raising, Linda, is, well, why are those genetic factors, or how are those genetic factors and environmental factors contributing? And I'm going to, I won't name names, but some people have argued that if educational attainment is heritable, then that's, quote unquote, a good thing. That shows that it's meritocratic. It might be consistent with meritocracy, that is, highly educated parents have the genes associated with the academic skills that led to high education. They transmit those genes to their offspring. But it also could reflect discrimination. That is, individuals that look a certain way, maybe because they have blue eyes or they're physically attractive, those are heritable traits that advantage you in the social system. So just merely saying something's heritable doesn't tell you whether or not it's meritocratic. Similarly, environmental mechanisms of intergenerational transmission of education could be based on the transmission of academic skills, but also could be based on, I think you were referring to this, to other things, that other advantages or disadvantages that parents might convey. So just the genetic and environmental part. These are the correlations for college attainment, so I guess they're tetracore correlations. There's a lot of assorted mating here, but this is a very typical pattern that you see. The monozygotic twins are more similar. It's actually quite similar in whether or not they get a degree. I assume most people at this point know this. I can put this into standard biometrical analyses and estimate the relevant variance components, and this is what you get. Roughly a third of the variance in educational attainment being associated with genetic factors, that's the heritability, 40% to the shared environment, 17% to the non-shared environment. And because of the family structure, we can estimate something called gene-environment correlation, which I'm not too worried about here. That's one study, but it does fit with the larger literature. This is a nice meta-analysis of family studies of educational attainment published. It's nice for a couple of reasons. It's published in a sociology journal, which is interesting. Again, a real shift in the field. But it actually combines data from many different countries. And one of the points, and here's probably the last time I'll make this point, is again, I'm looking at data from Minnesota, one state in the US. This is many countries. And if you look at this paper, what they'll show you is that the heritability, for example, of educational attainment is not the same across every country. It's not the same across historical epochs. It's not the same for men and women. They report that it's more heritable in men than women, and it's more heritable in recent birth cohorts versus earlier birth cohorts. So the type of thing I'm talking about may not generalize fully. I recognize that. But so we know that both environmental and genetic factors contribute to the intergenerational transmission of educational attainment, the familial aggregation of educational attainment. But I said I'm not just interested in that. I want to know why. I'd like to begin to understand why. With a group like this, one thing that's not hard to convince you is that, well, probably, going back to Bernstein's syllogism, is it's because IQ is being transmitted, or general cognitive ability. And this is just a plot of the standardized general, their IQ scores, essentially, as a function of the educational attainment. You can see that the thing that you know, the two are highly correlated. But as I think Dan Belsky pointed out, this association, and a sociologist would tell you that this is potentially confounded. You don't know cause or effect here. And there are a lot of criticisms and statements about this sort of thing that you see in the popular literature. This is one of my favorite ones. It doesn't apply directly to this. No doubt it frustrates me. It must frustrate you guys a lot more. Is when the New York Times and others publish the relationship between SAT scores and income, and then the claim being, well, the SAT is nothing more than your family income. You should just ask for their family income. Maybe this is confounded. Well, as has been pointed out many times this morning, and I think rather nicely, one way around getting around this confounding is to look at these effects within families rather than between families. And because I'm studying families, I can actually do that. But mostly when people look at within family comparisons, they look at horizontally related relatives like siblings or twins. I'm going to look at parents and offspring. And that's actually one of the unique features of our sample that I think provide us with an opportunity to gain interesting insights. This is a distribution of the difference in the education between the parents and their children. And you can see there's variance in this. More women moved up than men, but there's a greater movement up than down for both. But again, some do move down. I'm interested in this within family comparison, this intergenerational comparison, both because it addresses the confounding issue, but also, for me, more importantly, it gets at a phenotype I'm very interested in, and that is the educational mobility phenotype. When do you move up relative to your dad or your mom? When do you move down? And here I'm going to become shamelessly parochial. In the US, the social, political, economic scheme is justified by a myth. The American dream. And the American dream, again, I apologize. I know I'm not in the US and it's an international association, but it does condition my research. The American dream, as best I can understand, stems from a series of short stories written, I think it was in the 1860s, 1870s, by an otherwise undistinguished author named Horatio Alger, the Poor Dick series. And Horatio Alger talks about poor Dick, who's an orphan and poor, but through hard work and industry, he's able to succeed. And that's the American dream. That's the agreement we all have, that yes, we can have inequality, but the inequality is justified because the people who rose to the top worked hard, and they had the skills to do so, and the people who didn't choose to do that. Of course, if there's American dream, there's also American nightmare, and that's not often discussed, right? Those are the people who aren't working hard. They're going to fall down. As I'm sure you appreciate, no matter where you live in the world, there's concern that this social contract, this ability to move from across generations, is eroded over time. And it may be eroding a lot more recently. And when people talk about the erosion of the American dream, they often point to data like this. This is from the Pew Charitable Trust, published a little while ago. It's not educational attainment, it's, I think, family income. And what you're looking at here is that, again, you've probably seen something like this. As a function of quartile on family income, where you ended up versus where you started with the family of origin. And you can see that if you started at the bottom, then you're much more likely to end up at the bottom than if you started at the top. And that's often argued as an indication that we become a less mobile society. But clearly, as I'm sure you recognize, I understand that, there's no way you would expect that everyone should end up at the same, that the distribution should be independent of your outcome, should be independent of where you started, unless you assume that abilities are randomly distributed as a function of your background, which they aren't. So how can we unpack this? Here again is the relationship of general cognitive ability with how far one of our twins went in school. Here's the within family comparison. What I'm looking at here, and I'm going to show several graphs like this, is the difference in the educational attainment of parents and children versus the difference in their IQ. So when you move up, you tend to have a higher IQ than your parents. My dad was really, really smart, but I did move up. I don't know how to, so I'm the exception, I think. You move up, you have a higher IQ. You move down, you have a lower IQ than your parents. Not just a lower IQ, but a lower IQ than your parents. And this is just to make it a little bit more concrete. If children score a standard deviation higher or more than their parents, 37% moved up the educational ladder, only 8% moved down. The rest are the same. If they scored a standard deviation lower or more, 36% moved down, 11% moved up. So within family differences in IQ predict within family differences in educational attainment, but not perfectly. What about these ones? What about the off diagonal? I have to just make sure my time. Okay, so far. So what accounts for, right, there are people that they score a standard deviation higher, but they didn't make more than their parents. Or they score a standard deviation less and they made more. What's going on there? If you allow me another digression into my history, I went to Berkeley. Actually, I never met, I did meet Jensen later in my life. I never met him at Berkeley. And when he published his famous monograph in 1969, I was actually in high school. I wasn't even at Berkeley then. But if you read that, and maybe some of you had, it begins with a rather, I think, shocking statement. Compensatory education has been tried, and that's the first sentence in this monograph, and it has failed. Now, why did Jensen come to that conclusion? I'm going to come back to, I'm not completely daft. There's a link here. I hope to make it. Why did he say that? Back in the early 1960s in the US, we had something called the Great Society Program. And the goal, it was through, I think, a very good president for many reasons. He had his downsides too. Lyndon Johnson, he wanted to raise up. He wanted to ameliorate poverty. And part of this was to have early childhood education, something actually we returned to discussing more recently. And so there are a lot of studies at the time about how to boost the educational achievement of, intellectual achievement of kids. And the focus was on IQ, these early studies in the 1960s, because the notion was that IQ was related to so many good positive outcomes that if you could raise IQ, then these other things would be consequences for them. Jensen concluded that these intervention programs didn't work because they couldn't produce lasting, his monograph is based about that, they didn't produce lasting increases in IQ. This is maybe the most famous early intervention study, the Perry Preschool program in Michigan. This is the type of finding that you typically get. After the intervention ended, I believe, at age 5. It was 2 years long. It was rather intensive. There's maybe a 10-point IQ difference at the end between the intervention group and the control group at the end of the intervention, but you get this fade-out effect. And a much greater discussion, rather, if you haven't read it, I recommend it. Maybe here, John Protzko has a very nice discussion of this phenomenon. But this is what Jensen observed back in 1969. And that's what led him to the first sentence of his monograph. It failed because you didn't lead to enduring increases in IQ. But more recently, people have come back to Perry. And this is a publication by Jim Heckman, who I'll come back to a lot. It may not have led or resulted in enduring increases in cognitive ability, but it did seem to result in social benefits. The intervention group, more likely to complete high school, more likely to be employed, less likely to be arrested a large number of times. It didn't improve cognitive ability, apparently, but social outcomes seem to be a consequence. Why is that? I don't necessarily like the terms, but I'll use the terms. The economists have distinguished hard skills, which you talk about, cognitive ability, from soft skills, personality factors. What Heckman has argued, and certainly this notion doesn't originate with Heckman, but that both hard skills and soft skills are important to social outcomes. And actually, one of the things I find interesting, it's been fascinating to go to the conference here. I think I've learned so much, but I'm surprised at how that people don't study soft skills here as much as more than they do now. It certainly didn't originate. The notion, and I think Camilla talked about this yesterday, you need more than ability to succeed. You need ability and other things. Hard work is certainly a part of it. I don't know the first one to say that. It's probably Aristotle or something. But even the person who coined the term meritocracy, the labor leader, is it Michael Young? Michael Young? I think it's Michael Young. Talked about both hard work, effort, and ability. He didn't like the term meritocracy, but he coined it. Heckman might not have coined the term, but he certainly has done a lot to promote the distinction between the two. And the notion here is that what happened in Perry, his argument, and I can't vouch for that, but his argument is that what happened in Perry is that although they did not raise their IQ, they actually improved these soft skills. And it's the soft skills that actually led them to these better social outcomes. What I'm interested in is going to be a function of both hard skills and soft skills. We measure a lot of soft skills. Soft skills are more than just being industrious. It's being industrious, it's willing to delay reward, it's not breaking the rules, it's not being neurotic. And I'm just going to focus on a composite of these. Like, these soft skills predict how far someone goes in school, but again, that could be confounded. What if I compare my soft skills to my parents? If I score higher than my parents on soft skills, I tend to go further in school than they do. If I move down the educational ladder, I tend to have lower soft skills than my parents do. In our sample, I think Dan said in his sample the correlation between self-control and IQ was 0.4. I didn't even look up the exact value here because I know in our sample these two, IQ and soft skills, are correlated less than 0.2. They're not correlated much at all. So I can go back to this and I can say, I'll just look here. Children who score a standard deviation higher on both than their parents, that is, they're brighter than their parents, they work harder, they're less neurotic. 47% of them will go further in school. Only 2% don't go as far, go less in school. Both hard skills and soft skills are important. In the interest of time, I'll skip this. I'm supposed to talk about genetics. I can do that by looking at twins. I'm not going to talk that much about genetics, but I said the genetics. Here, the phenotype here, these are different scores. And I forget somebody asked about it. I didn't do anything to correct the reliability of the different scores. I apologize. But these are twin scores for the different scores. And difference between your score and your parent's score, by the way. I can throw this into a biometrical analysis. This is what I get. But you've heard a lot about these polygenic scores. I have to be modern as well. Emily talked about her sample. We've genotyped 8,400 members, 84% of our sample on a GWAS array. We generate the polygenic score for educational attainment. You know about that. The polygenic score for educational attainment is not surprising. Emily already showed this. is correlated with educational attainment in our sample. So this is the mean standardized polygenic score as a function of that individual's educational level. But again, it predicts within families. If I've moved up relative to my parents, I have a higher polygenic score than my parents. If I move down, I tend to have a lower polygenic score than my parents. James Flynn was talking yesterday about his comparison to him and his father, that they might have similar genetics. Well, of course, you get your genes from your parents, but you don't get your parents' genotypes. There is meiotic segregation. You get a sampling of them. So there is variability. And when you have a higher polygenic score than your parents, you tend to move up the educational ladder. When you have a lower polygenic score than your parents, you tend to move down relative to where they were. Why is that? Not surprisingly, the correlations are not great, but if you look at the correlation of difference in polygenic score with differences in the soft skills and the hard skills, there are significant, modest but significant correlation. These all hang together, and they all predict, all three of them predict not only educational attainment, but also other outcomes. This is IQ, the soft skills and polygenic scores. This is a quartile of their income at age 29, which is not a great phenotype, because a 29-year-old has not attained her or his ultimate income. But you can see they're significantly, modestly related there, but also with the status of their occupation. What have we learned from the twin study? And then I'm going to say a couple things. I got to see the time. Go ahead. Yeah, time. Sorry. So what intergenerational educational mobility is associated with parent-offspring differences in IQ and soft skills. You move up and down in your family depending upon whether or not you have greater ability than your parents, or you have the personality profile that's consistent with achievement to a greater degree than your parents. These are heritable contributions to educational mobility. We know that both from the biometric analysis, but also because of the PGS score. The second study I want to talk about, and I won't say as much about it, although I have a soft spot for the study. This is called the SIB study. I want to explain why the acronym Sibling Interaction and Behavior Study. It's an adoption study. And the reason we started this study is to investigate a certain phenomenon. Eric Turkheimer, I forget how long ago, not that long ago, published a legitimately widely cited article called The Three Laws of Behavioral Genetics. And then my colleague at the University of Minnesota, who you know well, James Lee, amended that to have a fourth law. Educational attainment does not conform to these four laws. It actually conforms very well to the first and to James's law. But those middle two, and particularly the second one, and Elliot was talking about this in his talk, behavioral geneticists for quite a long time argued that the shared environment was unimportant. But if you go back to the estimate here, 40% of individual differences in educational attainment appear to be associated with the shared environment. Now, this might be an overestimate due to sort of mating, but it's not zero. There's a substantial effect of the shared family environment on educational attainment apart from genetics. So we started this adoption study in order to try to understand how environments work. Because it's hard to understand how environments work in families where the people in the families are not only environmentally related, but they're also genetically related. We have a little over 400 adoptive families. We did this, I won't go through the details, but we did this very systematically. We actually ascertained families through adoption records. We got access to adoption records. And then also systematically through birth records, identified a parallel sample of non-adoptive families. We also get very good participation rates over time with the sample, the SIB sample. These are their average ages. One of the things, and I'll point this out in the next slide as well, I'm going to use data here at the second follow-up of the sample, the average age is 22, but some are 19 or 20 years old. They're not actually old enough to have completed college in every case. So that actually limits what we can do. But James Lee and I recently were funded on a project to do yet another follow-up of these individuals when the average age will be about 27 years old, and we'll be able to actually nail down accurately their phenotype of whether or not they got a college degree. Their IQs, in this case, what I'm going to look at is, at that second follow-up, whether or not they've either completed a college degree or they're still in college. And that's one limitation here. But that's the way, they're too young to have all had the opportunity to complete college. I can look at the adopted siblings, and there's actually a very strong, consistent with the biometric analysis of the twin study, the adopted siblings are not genetically related to one another at all. They're not genetically related. They correlate 0.37 in this phenotype, this educational attainment phenotype. That has to be due to some aspect of the environment they're sharing. It's not their genes. What is it? When we look at parent-offspring transmission of this educational phenotype, in the non-adopted families, these are the ones that are genetically related as well as environmentally related. By the way, we don't know anything about the birth parents of the adopted kids. We don't have that information. You see the standard thing that I showed you before, but this is a different sample, but not surprising. The greater number of parents you have that are college educated, the greater the likelihood you go to college. But we also get a significant effect in the adoptive families. The effect is not as great, 2.6 versus 1.5, but there's a significant effect here. And again, that can't be genetic. That has to be environmental. So there's something going on in the families environmentally that promotes educational achievement. What is it? We might argue, at least I would argue, that in a meritocratic system, we would expect that if we get this environmentally mediated effect of parent education on offspring education, it should be mediated by the skills they're transmitted to their children, right? To those hard and soft skills. These are the non-adopted siblings. So this reflects both genetic and environmental mechanisms, right? But the more educated, the more college-educated parents you have, the higher your IQ and the higher your soft skill composite. The key question is, what do the adopted kids look like? Are the adopted parents, who are definitely conveying educational advantage to their children, are they doing so by building the academic skills? And the answer to that is they aren't really building the academic skills. There's no effect whatsoever for personality characteristics. These are confidence intervals, so they're pretty wide. There's actually a significant effect here, but it's really modest. It's actually consistent with the larger literature. The more educated adopted parents you have, the somewhat higher IQ you have. But this in no way is enough to account for the familial aggregation of educational attainment in these families. In the non-adopted families, the odds ratio was 2.6, associated with having a parent with a college education on your likelihood of going to college. If I correct it for hard and soft skills, it declines to 2.1. In the adoptive families, the 1.5 is less. That's reflective of genetic mechanisms. But when I correct it, it actually does not, it increases the odds ratio a little bit. Educational attainment, our data suggests that educational attainment aggregates in families for environmental as well as genetic reasons. But the environmental reasons don't seem, now we could be missing some skills that the parents are, I admit that, although I do think we do a reasonable job of assessing them. They don't seem to be actually building the academic skills. It doesn't seem to be, in my interpretation is it's not meritocratic. They're doing something else. I don't know what it is. We haven't assessed that. But they're providing their children, it could be, right, it could be economic access to higher education. It could be economic access to lots of things. But it doesn't seem to be that they're building the academic skills. That's how they're getting their kids into college, not by making them brighter, not by giving them the personality characteristics that are needed in college, but by doing something else. And I would say that's counter to what you'd expect in a meritocracy. One of the things we looked at, okay, I'm going to finish on time. One of the things that we looked at, we thought, again, naively, we added in, we thought, well, maybe adoptive parents work more with their kids, right? And so we asked a whole bunch of questions about how much they help their kids with their homework and all that kind of stuff. And indeed, when we looked at the scale that we corrected for doing that, it correlated with how well they were doing in school and whether or not they went on to go to college. Unfortunately, negatively. The more help the parents gave, the less likely the kid was to do well in school. This is something that actually Ray Cattell recognized a long time ago. The coercion to the biosocial mean, I don't know if people still know the term, is that, well, if you think about it, if you have kids and you have more than one, then which one are you most likely to help? Not the one that's breezing through school, right, but it's the one that has problems. Something's going on here. I would argue it's not based on meritocratic skill building. It's actually, a sociologist would say, yeah, okay, obviously, that's what's going on. So, conclusion, and then if you have any questions. Why is this important? The Great Gatsby curve is a curve that was introduced by, this is from this publication by, actually he's a Canadian economist, Miles Carrack, I think he's at Ottawa. But the term Great Gatsby was coined by Alan Kruger, he was the chair of Obama's economic advice, Council of Economic Advisors. Great Gatsby, you know the novel? Fitzgerald. Fitzgerald was from the state I'm living in now, Minnesota. He hated Minnesota, absolutely hated it. So, but anyway, he was from there. So we still celebrate him. We're not that smart. So what the Great Gatsby curve is a display of, in this case, income inequality, the Gini index. Gini was the Italian statistician. It's a nice index. Varies from 0, everybody gets the same amount of income, to 100, it all goes to Warren Buffett, right? So, and versus intergenerational mobility. Usually the economists measure that by what they call elasticity, but it's basically parent-offspring resemblance for income. And what you see is there's actually a strong association between income inequality and social mobility, such that the greater the inequality, this is the converse of mobility. The greater the inequality, the lower the mobility. So as you go up here, it's lower mobility. There's greater stasis over generations. And my country, the way this graph makes it look is kind of in the middle. But really it isn't in the middle, because the countries these are the wealthy countries. And among the wealthy countries, the U.S. is kind of way out in the extreme there. Often you see this graph without the other countries in there. It was a little bit unfair. But there's this notion that as income inequality increases, social mobility will go down, which in this case would go up on the way they're scaling it here. And as you know, income inequality, at least in my country, in the U.S., has increased quite dramatically over the last 20 or so years. There was a period after World War II where it decreased quite a bit. So there is a concern, and there are a lot of publications. Here's a quote from Alan Kruger. It's hard not to be concerned that rising inequality is jeopardizing our tradition of equality of opportunity. Rising inequality is the Gini index. Equality of opportunity is social mobility. Social mobility is key to the way at least Americans think about what's fair in our system. And there seems to be a threat to it. There's a lot of publications recently about the meritocracy myth. I'm not going to won't review any of these for you, but there's a lot of anxiety surrounding these issues. And I hope with Dan's talk earlier today, with Emily's talk, with James's talk, I hope we begin to illustrate that there's a role for behavioral geneticists to play. I think it's an important role to begin to understand these social phenomena. So what I tried to do is illustrate the importance of within-family comparisons to study the social mobility phenomena within families, how children move up versus move down in their family. And what did I find? It's actually very simple. I could summarize it in a sentence. You tend to move up relative to the parents if you have inherited more of the genes for educational attainment, if you're brighter, and if you work harder. Conversely, you will tend to move down if you've inherited fewer of those genes, if you're not willing to work hard, and if you're less bright. But that's consistent with the meritocracy. But when we look at the between-family comparisons in the adopted families, we can see that at least in the US, parents can get their kids into college, but they appear to be getting their kids into college not by providing them with the skills they need in college, but by doing other things that I can speculate about. You can speculate as well as I can, but I didn't measure in our study. Now, one limitation again is, and we'll find out when James and I do the follow-up, we'll find it may be different to get your kid in college versus get your kid out of college. Although my bet, if I had to venture a guess on this, there are parents, they call them helicopter parents, they'll get them through as well. So I don't know that we'll get a diminished effect on the other end, but that's a possibility, we'll see. So to conclude, I want to acknowledge my collaborators. Bill Iacono, I've worked with Bill for 30 years. We co-direct these longitudinal studies. Wendy, who was a student at Minnesota, I don't know how many years ago, Wendy, but she's really inspired much of this work. James, I feel very fortunate as I approach my dotage to have someone bright who shows me how dull I really am, that I can talk to from time to time in my department. And then I don't recommend working with economists. I'm just kidding. But Aldo is an economist, and he's a lot of fun to work with. So thanks you.
I very much appreciated your talk, and I, of course, find it totally lamentable the sort of censorship that Herrnstein faced in terms of analyzing the effect of genes on social success. And I was very glad to see you acknowledging Heckman, who has done some very important work in this area.
I acknowledge you.
Heckman.
Yes.
Okay. And of course, I totally agree with you about how non-shared environment was neglected, even though it's a consistent 20% of IQ.
Shared environment, we call it.
Pardon?
Shared environment.
I'm talking about the environment that's supposed to come, let's say, from being dropped on your head because of...
That's the non-shared environment.
Right,
Yeah, okay.
non-shared environment has been neglected because it's an important source of autonomy. That is, you can, of course, have an accident like being drafted that changes your environment to a worse IQ environment.
Yeah.
But you can also be a patriot who leaves, let's say, practicing medicine to go into the army. And that's also a share of that environment. Mm-hmm. I did want, however, to say one thing, that Herrnstein's syllogism is diabolical. Because if you read in the bell curve, it's been turned into a sort of predictor of historical future, rather like Marxism. And I teach a course on method.
Like a dystopic.
That's
future.
right.
Yeah.
I mean, he turned it into something like the more welfare state, the more we will have a gene-stratified meritocracy, and the lower class will become a genetic dump, and on and on and on. And of course, those predictions are not validated. You just look at the Scandinavian countries. You know, here you have a very healthy welfare state, and it's not led to a lack of social mobility. You know, the lower class hasn't turned into a genetic dump that can't have social mobility, and it's rather like Marx. As I said, I used Marx as one example. He seemed to think that working class psychology was dictated by alienation from the means of production. And once you challenge that assumption, the whole thing falls down. And under conditions of affluence, more and more people will use their autonomy to pursue their own path. And they won't seek just conventional income success. In a fairly affluent society, they may, rather than be a corporation lawyer, teach at a low decile school. And if you look at Scandinavia, the equation of Bernstein in terms of historical prediction is falsified in many areas. So I just wanted to add that qualification with all of my endorsement of what you've done. There are legitimate reasons for criticizing Bernstein's fatal equation. And many of these are empirical reasons.
Okay, can I just a couple random, so I appreciate your comments very much. The first random thought is we're all going to be working for robots pretty soon, and we're all going to have a guaranteed income. I think that is inevitable. And the question is how we structure society.
Right.
And I think we need to understand these things better to come up with that. The other thing is, I think I might have misinterpreted you, and I'm pretty sure I did, but I want to make sure, is I don't think, I didn't know that Bernstein made that prediction, although I did read the bell curve. I wouldn't say the prediction is lamentable.
You wouldn't say what?
I wouldn't say it's lamentable. I think Bernstein or anyone should be able to make legitimate scientific predictions, and then, and I'm virtually certain we agree on this, and we should then debate the science.
Exactly.
And so he's either right or wrong.
Exactly.
Okay.
But within his equation, he appears to be self-evidently right.
Okay.
And that, of course, can't be
Yeah,
true
the
of all.
syllogism. Yeah.
You have to test it against evidence.
Okay, so I go this way and that way, so.
Yes,
Yes, sir.
okay, just two comments. One, perhaps the parents pay to get their kids into college.
Oh, yeah.
They may not tell you about it, but they can make phone calls and sort things out. So that's for the manipulation. I'm a little concerned about the social mobility thing, because if you truly advance in status, someone else has to lose status. Churn. And this is
Well, I mean, again, over time, more people have gotten college degrees.
Yes.
So I don't know that if I get a college degree, it makes it less likely that you get a college
Yeah,
degree.
no, well, two things. If you're talking about your ranking in society, then if you rise, someone else falls. The other way you do it is you make everyone a manager and everyone a professor, and they'll feel good for a while. All right? So I'm questioning the American worry about social mobility in the same way that I question people who say of Japan that it's a stagnant society because it's rich already and has stayed rich. Okay? I'm just making the point that I know it's a worry, but it doesn't have to be a worry so long as you get your best people onto the hardest jobs.
I think the reason, that I didn't make the point that maybe very well, that there is this statistical association between inequality and social mobility. But it doesn't seem to be causal. That is, as inequality has increased, social mobility has not really changed. There's actually, I didn't present any data, but that's actually true. There's some that say, well, yeah, but that's then, and now it's, the inequality has become so great that it will be, that things will change, and then we'll see a reduction in mobility. I don't know. Again, I can only talk about U.S. I mean, I understand the U.S. system a little bit, maybe not that well, but there's a lot of anxiety for parents in the U.S. about mobility because of inequality, even though they're separate phenomena, right?
Yeah.
If you don't go to college, our high school system is absurd, I think, in that the point of high school in the U.S. is to get into college.
Yeah.
As if, but then if you don't get into college, then what was the point of those 4 years of experience? And so, but you're not going to change that because parents are so anxious about the income inequality that exists.
Just to drive this point home, when everyone gets a college degree, it's no longer of much status to have a college degree.
Oh, yeah, well, you see that now with the credentialing. Now people have to get, in the U.S., a minister's degree. Tim, I don't know.
Also in that
Yeah, okay.
So that's
I'm so, okay, so you're revealing a lapse of mine. I did read the article in the 70s. I cannot get the article anymore.
I know.
It's, for some reason,
It's been taken off.
so that's an important point then. A point that I tried to counter. I don't know if I did it well, but I'd like to do it again because I think there are other people. I didn't know that Bernstein had made that article. I'm certainly, okay, 40 years I can forget. Okay.
Because
That's
Well,
right.
you could do the forward.
It could be completely discriminatory, a high heritability society. It could be the blue-eyed people get this and the brown-eyed people get that.
It depends on the heritability of the water, so.
Yeah.
Well, exactly, yeah.
It's
Yeah.
heritability,
But
but
heritability doesn't tell you fairness or merit, okay, my speech. But okay.
Thank you. I have a problem, I feel, with your criterion variable of entering college.
Well, then, okay.
Because colleges are by no means homogeneous. David Reisman years ago referred to the academic procession, which implied that with respect to their SAT scores and sub-SAT scores, where they didn't even give the SAT in some colleges, they were strung out over an enormous ability range.
Yeah.
And I have looked at data on SATs and transformed them and noticed that some colleges imply average IQs in the 80s. And years ago, Kronbach, I think, suggested a minimum IQ of 115 to go to college in those days. And maybe to get out. And so we have people going to college nowadays that never would have gone to college in times past because there was no economic benefit to it, and people couldn't afford the luxury of affording their kids a 4-year vacation and enrichment experience, and a chance to find a mate, perhaps. So that if you use this as a variable that doesn't make these distinctions, then it disguises what may be going on with these more able parents, with the less able children, who are able still to get their children into college without showing any evidence of meritocratic improvement in the children, because they can blow the tuition on sending them to podunk or whatever it is, youth for 4 years, where the kid has a good time and the parent feels he's done his duty.
Yeah, I completely
Charles
agree with
Murray,
you.
in fact, argues for a variety of reasons that we should be trying to get the enrollments in college down, not up.
That's right, that's right.
Okay, you do that with your kids. I agree. You're right. You're absolutely. There are people in our sample with an IQ of 80 that have a college degree. I actually think that's kind of interesting. What Aldo, the economist, one of the things he's good at, we actually now, I didn't do any analysis, we haven't done any analysis, but we know what colleges they went to now. And we know the average SAT or whatever score of admissions to that college. And we know what majors, and we'll look at that. I agree, absolutely, so. Should I stop?
People want to, people care about time, I'm easy.
Our guest has a question.
Well,
And this is perfect because you're looking at the son of the inventor of meritocracy.
oh, really?
Yeah.
Yes.
Did I get it right? It's Michael Young, right?
Yes, it's Michael
Yes,
Young.
you've got
Yes,
it right.
and you're his son?
No,
I'm
no,
sorry.
no, no.
Yes.
Yeah, Young did, yes.
Yeah, and you're right.
And by devoting time to cultivation of my children's academic skills, I can affect where they end up. And that's fairer than a society in which there's really nothing I can do. It's entirely dictated by their polygenic skills.
One of the things I hope
It's entirely random. Entirely dictated by polygenic.
I think the question was addressed to Matt.
I'm really slow on the uptake. I'm still wondering about how you're related to Michael Young.
He's the son.
I tried to be very careful, but maybe I slipped. Not to use the term fair and unfair. We might differ as to whether or not we think meritocracy is a fair system. All I was trying to ask is, does the system appear to be meritocratic, which some people argue is a fair system, and other people would argue is an unfair system, even if it's meritocratic. So I tried not to use those terms, even though I mean, I have a notion of maybe what's fair and unfair, but I recognize that people have different notions of that. You don't determine your genes, but you don't really determine the household you grow up in either. I mean, it gets back to what agency do you actually have? I think it's just better to work with the fiction that we all have agency and proceed that way, because even if we don't have agency, I think the converse would be rather disruptive. So
I was just thinking for the parents.
oh.
If they think that that they might have a great.
Oh, I think they would,
think
yes,
there's nothing they
for
can
sure, because they can control it, yes. But they'll control the genotypes maybe soon too. Okay, I apologize for going over. Thank you very much.